I'm Jonathan Tomkin from the University of Illinois. What would cause a J trend? What would cause, in effect, a return to Malthusian conditions? Because if we're living unsustainably, then we have to crash back down into either a level where there's very few people, or we have to crash back down to that point where there's just that subsistence living. So in other words, the median person is just at the edge of starvation. Doesn't appear in the 21st century at least that this will be due to resource limitations. We have sufficient soil, water, energy, natural resources, minerals, that we don't see in the course of this century the danger that this would all be used up in a fashion that would cause a Malthusian style crash. Take the example of oil extraction. If the cost of oil extraction doubled, then this would only increase fuel prices in the United Kingdom by about a quarter, because most of the cost for fuel at the pump in the United Kingdom is in government taxes. Even in this case, the cost of filling up your tank in the United States would be less than in present-day Germany. So the thing about the rich world is that it has so much room for manoeuvre because it is so wealthy that even if there are increases in some of these basic commodity prices, it's not going to create a return to the Malthusian condition. The buffer zone between what the developed country's lifestyle is and what a Malthusian environment would be is too large for that. So really we'd be looking at something that would cause a societal level collapse. What might do that? Collapses in prehistoric societies appear to be connected to drastic changes in the level of agricultural output. So what might cause that in the modern world? Well, there could be things that are beyond human control, supervolcanoes or asteroid strikes. But if we're looking in the sense of sustainability, that is within society's remit, there's a couple of things that come to mind. The first is that nuclear war could create a nuclear winter. Even a limited nuclear exchange could create the conditions under which we would see a blanketing of dust in the atmosphere that could cause worldwide crop failures. Another possibility is that if we have runaway climate change, the models that we're seeing that the scientists predict for the 21st century don't predict this runaway effect. But nevertheless, it is possible. If this were to happen, then the changes to the environment would be too fast for farmers to keep up, and agricultural yields could plummet. In both of these cases, we would see a dramatic drop in the amount of food produced, and this is a recipe for a Malthusian condition. So we might see large population loss and, of course, collapse of the sorts of societies that we see around the world today. Another possible reason for collapse is that we've made industrialised societies too fragile. In an earlier talk this week, I spoke about ecosystems. In particular, I spoke about biocomplexity. The observation is that in ecological systems, the more complex it is, the more stable it is. So this idea of fragility versus resilience. Resilient systems return back to normal after a perturbation. So for example, if we have a climate cycle that's a little bit different, we have a drought one summer, then the system can recover. A fragile system might not be able to recover. So if I can make a contrast, we might say a natural prairie can withstand a drought condition, whereas a monoculture might not be able to do that. And so historically in the United States, we might think about the Dust Bowl conditions. There was an extended drought, and this caused the land to dry up, and a lot of this topsoil ended up being blown away. And so the land wasn't able to return to its previous state. What if we use this as a metaphor to describe modern society? Have we become too fragile? One way you might see how an agricultural system has become too fragile is if we over-rely on one species. There's a classic example of that which is truly tragic. Monocultures are locally fragile relative to diverse ecosystems. Consider the Irish potato famine. This occurred in the mid-19th century when one disease, a potato blight, caused the potato crop failure for the island. Since a third of the entire population relied on potatoes as their only food source or primary food source, approximately 1 million individuals died and a further 1 million people immigrated from the country. So this made an incredible impact on Ireland's history. Speaking more generally then, do we expect that the modern systems of today are too close to this monoculture that we saw in Ireland in the 19th century? Are we in danger of just having an accidental event, like for example a disease, causing such a disruption that it causes a collapse in the social system of developing countries or developed countries? To me, this doesn't seem very likely. There's a couple of reasons for this. Firstly, although there are many local monocultures, and I mentioned as an example the monocultures that we have in the place that I live with corn, but actually on a global scale, there are still very many different varieties and very many different types of crops. And in fact, no one crop, for example, dominates the cereal production of the planet. So coupling this with the fact that countries now are more open to trade is that we see the possibility that the globe as a whole is actually somewhat resilient despite local areas of possible failure. Societies that have suffered these sorts of collapses, perhaps like Ireland or most starkly, say, Easter Island, weren't integrated into a global network. When this is the case, as we see in the modern world, there is the ability for there to be a local failure, but that to be supported by the rest of the network. What about an S-style growth curve for the Earth? To me, this seems more likely. One of the reasons I think this is more likely is that we pretty much already have the technology to deal with all of our current issues. Because population growth is not on a J-style trajectory, everything else can be managed. It would be expensive, perhaps unfeasibly so at present, to deploy it now, but if things were slowly deteriorating, we would be able to move to new agricultural systems, to new energy systems, to new water management systems. And so we'd actually be able to use these resources sustainably in the long term, just with current technology. The fact that this is possible should be a very comforting thought. Think about the reindeer on St. Matthew's Island. They didn't have this option. So it is indeed possible that our societies would not be in this position, that we would be able to make this transition. But I believe that we have the ability to do so if we want. This is particularly important because although global societies are more robust than local societies, the Earth taken as a whole is of course its own island. This doesn't mean that the future is simple. One reason why we might have S-curve style growth is because we have a future of limitations. If energy, water, food, mineral resources become more expensive because we've hit these resource limitations, then things might be sustainable as we transition to these new technologies. But growth in living standards will be slow or non-existent or even negative. The natural world could suffer too, as there will be more demand for those natural systems to be turned over to things that humans need to support their societies and economies. The current world under this scenario could be the richest that will ever be known, because perhaps if we're living unsustainably now and we have to cut back as the 21st century progresses, our descendants will be less well off than we are, despite technological progress. The number of humans on the Earth might be past some nominal carrying capacity. And here we would say that there might not be a crash, but there could be a slow descent. If this scenario is true, this is bad news for the planet and its natural systems, but it's also bad news for people, particularly the poorer people around the world. The World Bank estimated that in 2008, 1.3 billion people were living in absolute poverty. Absolute poverty is really the Malthusian state, where there is no hope for progress, merely the hope that you can feed yourself for the next day. If the world doesn't have the resources in the 21st century to lift people such as this out of poverty, then we will see a lot of human misery. There is some evidence that this is the path we're on, however. Some have argued that dematerialisation in the rich world is not because people are choosing to move away from things, but because they can't afford it anymore. So we're hitting a limit in the amount that we consume because we're in something of a slump. increased prices of increasingly scarce resources means that we can no longer afford the increase in consumption patterns that we saw through the 20th century. There's another possible end to the 21st century, however. Perhaps we can reach sustainability through prosperity. If we can share and develop the technologies that we have so that countries all around the world can be made more efficient, and if we see better governance, better environmental policies, and higher crop yields, even in developing countries, we might see that everywhere on the earth, people will have smaller families, they'll be healthier, they'll be wealthier. Under this scenario, we would see a more sustainable end to the 21st century than the beginning, and yet people would be materially better off. There is one wild card in this sort of analysis, however. Note that even in the most hopeful scenario, there will be regional tragedies. Climate change and land use changes will both impact native ecosystems. And so we will see habitats lost, species made extinct, natural systems disrupted. On the other hand, these 21st century tragedies might not be any worse than the tragedies that we've seen in the 20th century. If we think back, we can already see that there are so many examples of habitats destroyed, rainforests, wetlands, oceans, and plants and animals lost, that it's entirely possible that the damage that the people of the 21st century do to the planet is no greater or even less than what the people of the 20th century have done. Perhaps the shocking thing that we've learnt in this course is that the trend lines for the Earth are more sustainable than we might have guessed. Societies appear to be taking this idea that we need to be sustainable to heart. This is largely because of the actions of individuals, and the actions of those individuals are filtering through the rest of the society. I'd like to thank all of you for taking this course, and I hope it's been worthwhile. It's certainly been worthwhile for me.
Produced by OCE Atlas Digital Media at the University of Illinois, Urbana-Champaign.